Have you ever wanted to learn some of the tricks that the LSAT uses to make a logical reasoning question more difficult? If so, keep watching as we write a question just like one that would appear on the LSAT and add some of the same elements that the LSAT would add to transform an otherwise straightforward question into a challenging test of precise reading and logic. Now, for a disclaimer, I don't work for the LSAC, and the question we come up with in this video is not a real LSAT question. However, as an LSAT tutor and instructor with years of teaching experience and a perfect 180 on a real exam, I can assure you that the lessons you learn in this video are directly relevant to real LSAT questions. So let's get right into it. Now, most logical reasoning questions involve an argument that's invalid, which means that the conclusion is not actually proven by the premises. So let's start there. And the issue that I want to test today is the distinction between the intent or purpose of an action and its effect. So let's start with a premise that says Acme Corp did not intend for its app to increase rates of depression among its users. And the conclusion will be, thus the app does not increase rates of depression among its users. So of course the problem with reaching this conclusion is that the app could have had unintended effects. Now, since this argument is a little bit too straightforward, let's add a couple of things to make it more difficult without changing anything about the actual flaw in the argument. First, instead of stating the full conclusion explicitly, I'll hide it a bit by making the conclusion a rejection of someone else's view. So now I'll start with many critics of social media contend that Acme Corp's app increases rates of depression among its users. And the conclusion will be, however, this claim should be rejected. Actually, I'll make that, however, this claim is false. And the premise about lack of intent, I'll just move that to the end of the argument, comma, since the company did not intend for the app to increase depression rates among its users. Now, one more thing I'll do to make the first sentence a little bit more complicated is I'll throw in a line about what the critics are using to support their own contention. So here I'll put, comma, citing recent findings from large-scale studies of internet use among teenagers, comma. Now this phrase doesn't change anything about how we should understand the argument, since the conclusion is still the rejection of this contention. But it's just one more thing that might make reading this stimulus more difficult. Now another thing I want to do is change the premise a little bit to make it harder to identify as a premise, and then I'll also make it a little bit harder to understand. So first, the word since will become after all, and I'll start a new sentence here. And this phrase after all means the same thing as since, in that it's introducing the support for a conclusion. But a lot of people aren't as familiar with this phrase as a premise indicator as they are with the word since. Now, another thing that I'll add here is this phrase, it is clear that. Now, this is going to make some people think that the last sentence is a conclusion because this phrase often does introduce a conclusion, but it doesn't have to. And in this case, the last part is still going to be a premise because it's providing the reason that the critic's contention should be rejected. I also want to change this part about lack of intent. And instead of saying the company did not intend for the app to increase depression rates, I'll change it to the company did not intend for the app to have such harmful consequences. And this phrase, such harmful consequences, is of course a reference to increasing rates of depression. That should be pretty clear, I think, but it might confuse some people because of the shift in language. And it might make some people think that the argument's assuming that depression rates or depression is a harmful consequence, but that's not the issue being presented. This is just a phrase that is a reference to depression rates. And characterizing those depression rates as harmful has nothing to do with the actual logic of the argument, has nothing to do with why the author is reaching this conclusion. Now, there's one more thing that I want to do with this last sentence. Right now, the flaw itself might stand out a little bit too much because the premise directly refers to intent. So I might want to use a little bit of different language here that still refers to intent, but just may not be as obvious. So what about something like, it is clear that the company did not design the app to have such harmful consequences. So did not design the app to have these consequences is the same thing as was not intended, or rather did not intend the app to have these consequences, but it might throw some people off the trail of the flaw here. So here is our final stimulus, and the actual substance of the argument is the exact same as what we started with, the exact same. But it's just a little bit harder to understand if someone's not thinking precisely enough about what they read. Now let's turn to the question type, and because this is a flawed argument, it lends itself to any of the questions that involve a flawed argument, such as flaw, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, perhaps strengthen or weaken, and today I'll make this a flaw question. The question stem, I'll make the argument above is most vulnerable to criticism because it blank. Now let's start with the answer choices, and I'll start with the correct answer. So the problem here is that the lack of intent to cause depression does not prove that the app isn't causing depression. Here's one way to word that correct answer. Overlooks the possibility that the app can cause effects it was not intended to have. This is correct because if this possibility were true, it points out how the app could cause increased depression rates despite the fact that it wasn't intended to do so. Now here's another way to present the correct answer. Takes for granted that the app cannot produce a certain effect if it was not intended to produce that effect. Takes for granted means assumes, so this would be correct since the argument is assuming that its premise about not being intended to increase depression rates leads to its conclusion, proves its conclusion that the app does not actually increase depression rates. If the premise is true, then the conclusion must be true. That is something the argument's assuming. Now we could go on with all other kinds of correct answers, but that would make this video a little bit too long, so I'm just going to go with this second answer, but I actually want to word the assumption a little bit differently. So now it'll say, takes for granted that in order for the app to produce a certain effect, it must have been intended to produce that effect. And this is just another way of saying the exact same assumption. It's saying that the intention to produce the effect is required to produce it, which means if it wasn't intended to produce the effect, it doesn't actually do it. And now for the fun part, we need 4 wrong answers. And I want to make 2 of them trap answers, ones that might be tempting to someone who knows what they're looking for or almost knows what they're looking for, but they might still pick these answers. So here's the first trap answer. Presumes, without justification, that if the app does not produce a certain effect, it could not have been designed to produce that effect. Now, do you see what's going on here? This one sounds really close to something that would be correct, but it just reverses the direction of the actual assumption. The actual assumption starts with the premise about lack of intent and assumes if that's true, then that means there is no effect, assumes that that leads to the conclusion. But this answer is saying it assumes that if the conclusion part is true, then that leads to the premise, but that just gets it backwards. Here's another potential trap answer. Takes for granted that identifying the effects the app was designed to produce is the only way to determine the effects it in fact produces. Now this one might be tempting because the argument's premise does refer to lack of intent, and then it does use that as a reason why the app doesn't have an effect. But all that means is that the argument is assuming that lack of intent is one reason why we know there isn't an effect. In other words, the premise is just one of the reasons that we know the conclusion is true. But there could be other reasons that the author of this argument thinks the app doesn't increase rates of depression. Just because they gave you one premise that they think proves their conclusion doesn't mean that they think that's the only issue, that's the only premise that could ever be relevant to the conclusion. So that's why this is wrong. The author is not assuming that this is the only way to determine the effects of the app. Now that we have our trap answers, let's come up with some wrong answers that are a lot less tempting, but might still trick someone who isn't reading carefully and doesn't know what they should be looking for in the answers. So here's what I'll come up with. The first one will be, rejects a conclusion on the grounds that it was offered by sources who are biased. Now, this is clearly wrong since there's nothing in the stimulus to suggest that the critics are biased, and in any case, the premise of the argument had nothing to do with the critics being biased. That's not the reason for the conclusion. The second junk answer will say, overlooks the possibility that the app is addictive to users and decreases their self-esteem. So now this might tempt someone who thinks that the conclusion of the argument is that the app is good to use or okay to use or doesn't have any negative effects. But it's wrong because whether it has these other negative effects has nothing to do with whether it has the effect of causing increased depression rates, which is what the conclusion was actually about. Now that we have our answers, let's just go ahead and arrange them randomly. And there you go, one LSAT question. So I hope you found this peek into how an LSAT question is written helpful, and if you're looking to learn more from your mistakes, you should consider trying a similar process when it comes to reviewing the problems that you got wrong. Can you simplify the stimulus to its core elements and spot how the LSAT makes understanding those elements more difficult? Can you see what kinds of misinterpretations or wrong answers are trying to prey on? These are some of the questions that you can ask yourself to help you build a deeper understanding of logical reasoning on this test.